Okay, great to be here. My name is Agnes Hammarstrand, and I work as an IT lawyer. So I'm not the kind of lawyer that are in court all day, but I'm the kind of lawyer that are writing agreements, negotiating, and also giving advice to companies within the IT sector. It's a great job. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the law, and specifically as regards to data and processing of personal data. So I hope that you are really thrilled to discuss this area. Great. So let's start then. What is this and why is it so much fuss about it? How many of you are Europeans? Most of you. Okay, great. Have you heard about this new regulation? Oh, great. Almost everyone. That's perfect. And I have 20 minutes to explain something about this. And I can tell you one thing, that it's the most complicated and most long legal act that I have been working with since I've started to work as a lawyer. So I'm trying to give you some highlights about what this is about. And first of all, it's a new EU regulation. It's direct applicable. It means that normally we're used to local laws in each EU country, but now we actually have a direct applicable regulation, which should be the same. It is the same, and it should be interpreted the same in all EU countries. So that's a quite big difference. It's applicable for all EU companies and public authorities, and for all their processing of personal data. It's also applicable for companies selling to EU citizens, which is quite interesting. And this regulation is actually already adopted, but it will come into force in May 2018. So you have 1.5 years to prepare for this new regulation from now. One of the reasons why there is so much discussion about this is the sanctions. And perhaps you have heard about this already. This is something very new for most European countries, that you actually could be fined up to 4% of the annual global turnover in case of breach. It's quite a lot, isn't it? Yeah. And I'm not going to scare you. I mean, of course, it's not like that you will be fined directly as soon as someone is doing something that is not compliant. But what the legislator wants to achieve is that you should start having processes, start having routines, start documentate how you comply with the legislation. And if you don't do that, if you don't have any projects, any routines, if you don't do what you have to do according to the act, it's possible to get these fines. There are also possibilities for the registered individual to require damages, and you can also get penalties and things for breach of the regulation. So, when does this law apply? Well, it applies to all processing of personal data. Do you know what personal data is? Yeah, you can read it here. So it's all information that could be connected to an individual in any way, direct or indirect. It doesn't matter if the data is encrypted. It doesn't matter if you, as a company, can access the data. It's still personal data. And it's everything. It's not just business to consumer related information. It's all type of data relating to an individual. It could be an email address to someone at a position at the company. It could be even an IP address if it's not a computer in a public environment, for example. So you see, personal data is quite a lot. And it basically, the regulation basically applies to everything you do with the personal data. One very important thing is who is responsible for the processing of the data to comply with the legislation. And the main responsible entity is the controller. That's the company that decides to have a certain register or a certain collection of data. So basically, as a company, you are responsible for your customer database, for your employee database, for your database with contact details to suppliers, not the IT supplier. And that's a very common mistake that people within IT are making. They think, okay, but our supplier, they can take care of this. We don't have to do with this. We have outsourced our IT environment. But that's not the way it works. You are always responsible for your data that you have decided to collect when you are designing the purposes and means of that collection of data. Are you with me? Are you surprised? No? So that's important. There is also a possibility to have joint responsibility. But what about the suppliers, the IT suppliers, the processors of data, the ones that are in some way storing or having access to the data? And I'm saying or having access because it's sufficient if they are storing the data, even if they don't have any real access to the data. Well, they are processors and they also have a responsibility. And what's new in this legislation is that they have a direct responsibility. They could actually be reviewed and fined if they are not complying with the legislation. As an IT supplier, if they are, for example, a cloud supplier, storing data, even if they don't have any access to the data at all. And when you have this relationship, it's very important to regulate this in an agreement. And that's why it's so important if you're purchasing a cloud service, IT supplier of any kind that are going to store or process personal data, that you involve your lawyer in this decision. So that the lawyer can actually make a correct legal check of the agreement, of the processing, if this is done in a correct way. I always get the question when I'm talking to IT people, does it matter where the server is based? Perhaps someone were preparing that question as well. And perhaps you have heard about one of the rules in both the All Personal Data Directive and the new ones that states that as a main rule, you're not allowed to move person data or process person data outside the European Union. Have you heard about that? Yeah. And that's one of the rules in this regulation. And have you ever walked through a stairs? Yeah, I guess so. You can't just jump up to the highest step in a stair, right? And that's what some people do when they ask me, okay, but we have the servers in Sweden, so then it's fine. Then we comply with this regulation. Up, I say, no. You are missing all the other steps here. You have to walk it step by step. You have to check, is the processing legal? Is the collection of data at all legal? Could you do what you want to do with the data? That's the first question. When you have answered that, you need to walk through the next step and ask, do you comply with all the fundamental principles in the regulation? And I don't have time to go through them all, but one of them is that you don't store data too long time, which is a very common mistake. You store it forever, but perhaps you should only store it for 1 year after a customer made a purchase or whatever in a certain situation. So that's also something important. Then you have special requirements for sensitive data, if you're storing, for example, health data. And then you have requirements in the Act, like you have to give information, like a privacy policy. Have you read them, anyone? You click them, accept them when you are online all the time. That's one requirement. You have security. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. You have requirements for legal agreements and documentation. And then you have a prohibition to transfer the data outside the EU and to use suppliers storing the data outside the EU if you don't have a legal ground, a legal basis for that. So it is possible, of course, to transfer data and to process data outside the EU. But you need to make sure to do it in accordance with the regulation. And there are a few requirements to do that. So that's just one of all the requirements in the regulation. And you can't forget all the other ones, which is quite common to do when you're thinking about it from an IT perspective. So as you see, it's not my purpose to make this complicated, but it's important to think about that there are a set of rules that you need to think about. So you don't say, okay, we store our data within Sweden, so we comply with the regulation. Okay, great, you comply with one requirement. So what could you do then? Is everything illegal? No, of course not. Quite a lot of the things you want to do is actually legal to do. But you need to make sure that you have a legal ground for it. And one example is that you are allowed to do everything that's necessary to comply with the legal obligation you have. For example, if you have a legal obligation according to accounting principles, you need to store data to do that. Of course, you're allowed to do that, because that's a requirement you have according to law. That's not a problem. The problem is when you're using that data to other purposes, which a lot of companies are doing, using it for marketing purposes. But that's not the reason why you're storing that data. You are also allowed to process data in order to comply with an agreement you have with a customer. If you're selling goods online, of course, you're allowed to process the data in order to deliver the goods and do everything that's necessary for that. And if you want to do something more, you could also rely on case law, which states that some things are allowed. And if you are not having a legal ground according to these principles, you could also obtain consent. And that's also one very popular mistake to make, that you think that you always need a consent. That's not true. You only need a consent when you don't have any other legal basis for processing the data. And it's one of my recommendations to not obtain consent if you don't need it. Because a consent is something that always could be withdrawn from the individual. So a little bit of a summary here. What is the purpose? What is the legal basis? And if you don't have a legal basis, then you need to obtain the consent. And then, when you have decided the purpose, it's important to make sure that you comply with other basic principles in the regulation. For example, that you're not storing person data for a longer period than necessary. That people are not getting access to the data in a greater extent than necessary. Then, of course, we have security requirements. That's one thing that are important. And now you need to think about that this regulation is a regulation that should apply to everyone. To public authorities, to banks, to medical companies, and to small startups. So then you can understand that it's not possible to detail any security requirements in the legal act, in the regulation. And you should be happy of that, because otherwise you had to comply with the highest set of rules, right? So basically, the legislation as such does not specify in detail perhaps the things that you want to know, the security requirements in detail, because that's not possible. Then everyone would have the same requirements, and that would not be, of course, good. So instead, you need to make an own assessment. In my industry, for my type of company, what security requirements could we have? And that's something that also EU will come and have code of conduct in different industries and say, okay, in this industry, you need to do this. And there are already certain such recommendations, binding or non-binding. For example, if you are storing health data, then you have much harder restrictions. So security requirements, it's both technical and organizational measures. I think you all know that already. And it could be a lot of things. But what's important here is to always think about to decide this in relation to your organization. Because there are a lot of companies that want to sell different types of solution, technical solution, encryption solutions, whatever. And they just say, okay, you have to buy this to comply with the regulation. There are no such requirements. It depends on what your company have for requirements. And you have to start there before you're purchasing different services or products in order to comply with the regulations. I meet a lot of suppliers that are trying to sell different solutions just to say that's necessary. A lot of things here today. I just want to mention a little bit about privacy by design. Privacy by design is when you as a company have an obligation to design the IT systems and products out of a privacy perspective. And it's the same there again. I'm sorry for being so fussy, but you have to relate that in order to what type of requirements you are having in your organization. And depending on that, take into account all the privacy principles. For example, it could be that you avoid free text fields, that you have access control, default store settings, and so on. Certain of these requirements are, of course, the same for all of you. I mean, I'm having workshops with companies, and there are always some things that you need to ensure. But there are also a set of rules that are different from different companies. So I'm going to sum up a little bit. There are many other news. I'm not going to tell you all of them because we don't have time. But what does this mean in practice? Well, it means that this regulation is a question of top management. It's something that you have to work in with all your companies. It's really important now. And you need to set a budget. I'm going to show this because what's the purpose of this picture? Well, it is to show that this is not only about legal issues. This is not something you can ask your lawyer to just fix. And it's not something you can ask your security guy to just fix, because it's a mixture. This is something we need to do together. There are legal requirements. You need to write legal texts and agreements, things like I'm doing. But you also need to take aware of the technical security requirements, the organizational issues, routines, things that doesn't at all relate to law or security. So when you're having a project, which is something I really recommend, or something you have to do in your companies, make sure that you engage people with different competence and background that are involved in this project. And ensure that you actually start this compliance project as soon as possible. This is something you need to budget for now, because this is something you need to do next year. Otherwise, it's too late. And here are some tips about that. How do you feel about this? In Swedish, I normally say pool is kul, but I don't know if this is something you would, how you translate this to English. So those of you that are English speaking, actually just say that this is a very fun area. Although it might feel a bit complicated to explain in 20 minutes. But I will be here afterwards if you have any questions. And I'm very happy to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes.